Great. Thank you very much indeed, Caroline, for that illustrious introduction. Shall I load up my slides on my screen, or do you have... Aha, okay, good. Excellent. Thanks very much. There it is. Right, great. Yes, very illustrious introduction. Goodness me. I don't know where you got all that from. But, but anyway, yes. Thank you for that. So, yes, what I want to talk about really today, it's been a fantastic day so far. I've learned such a lot about different perspectives of East Kent, somewhere that I'm from. I was born in Deal. Well, born in Dover, actually, funny enough. See, I don't know even that. And grew up in Deal, and then I've more or less lived here for a big portion of my life. So it's fascinating to learn these different perspectives, as is, of course, fascinating to see how maps can give you a very different perspective on a familiar landscape that you think you may know. So just to whet the appetite a little bit on this opening slide, you'll just see a little glimpse there of the Soviet map of Dover, which I'll talk about a little bit later on, the city plan in a bit more detail. But you can already see perhaps from this that one of the ways in which maps are useful is certainly as an organising framework for which to sort of pin lots of different observations and ideas, but not only that, because they also give us a narrative of perhaps how we rewrite our experience of the landscape. So there is a real sense, I think, that when we see maps, really especially of those places that are familiar to us, through very different ways, using different styles, different symbols, that sort of thing, then we can look at them in a fresh way, and sometimes unsettling way as well. So maps have the ability to do that. My background, as you know, is in cartography and geography, so that's usually how I tend to try and look at the world. So if you think about the Soviet military mapping project, this was a project that really had its roots in the international map of the world that was proposed right at the end of the 19th century by Albrecht Penck, who was a German geomorphologist. And he said, let's get together and create an international map at the scale of 1 to 1 million that would be effectively a resource for solving environmental problems. He was a visionary, really, ahead of his time. And even though a lot of countries got together to produce and come up with the specifications, produce these maps at 1 to 1 million scale, actually the project sort of ground to a bit of a halt. A couple of world wars didn't help throughout the 20th century, and so the project didn't really get off the ground. By the time we got to the 1960s, it was almost certainly evaporated. About 400 sheets had been produced out of the expected sort of 2,500 or so. However, what was very interesting is that the Soviet Union, in mapping the vast territories that they occupied, basically from World War II onwards, then established this whole idea of organising the mapping of the world. So the 1 to 1 million scale and the sheet nomenclature was adopted. The world was divided up into these squares of millions, if you like, million scale maps. And effectively, each of those maps was then subdivided. So you see the grid here, just to give you a bit of an idea. This was the world divided into zones of 6 degrees longitude and 8 degrees latitude, effectively then to kind of divide up the world. Well, as I've just shown you, and I forgot to point out that the red square there just shows you where Dover would be located in that 1 to 1 million sheet, which actually is entitled Paris because that's the major settlement within that sheet. But ultimately then we have this project to map the world, a global topographic mapping project. And if we just have a look at the little extract I've got here at the top that shows you where Dover is, you can understand a little bit about how these maps were intended to be used, really to give the military an overall assessment of terrain, what the major routes were, for example, the major functions of various cities and towns, particularly ports. And you can see, if you look very, very closely, that by Dover there's the port symbol, which is a ship with a couple of masts. For example, you can see Folkestone has also got one of those. You can also see a little airstrip symbol, which is the plane down towards Lyd. And you can see below that the diagram that shows the administrative divisions that are on the sheet as well, incorporated on these sheets, and the diagram that's showing you where the adjacent sheets would be in that series. So this would be M31 in that map of the world nomenclature. If you have a look on the right-hand side, in each of the Soviet military maps, you'll get a sense here, I think by the end of this presentation, that there is a print code which is embedded within the margin of each of these maps. And this one here tells us that the map was printed in March 1986, and basically it was compiled in 1968 and then revised in 1985. So we get a bit of a sense then of this being an ongoing project. And if we then understand a little bit about how this was a multi-scale endeavor, so the Soviet Union did not just map the world at 1 to 1 million, but actually mapped it at lots of other scales as well. And each of these squares that were 1 to 1 million were then subdivided into 1 to 500,000 sheets, and then those were subdivided into 1 to 200,000 sheets, and so on and so on. And the nice thing about Dover is actually, and I won't go through these too slowly because there's a lot to say about the plan of Dover, but if you just have a look here, you'll see this is the 1 to 500,000 sheet. Well, Dover actually features on a full set of these topographic maps. So you can see here, for example, the 1 to 500,000 sheet, lots more details start to appear. You can see the little stations, for example, starting to appear on the railways. A lot of detail was given to showing the transport as well as the settlements and the cover, certainly at 1 to 500,000. Again, the sheet here says that this was printed in 1985. If we then divide that further, we see the 1 to 200,000 sheet looks a little bit like this. Again, we can start to see the morphology of Dover a little bit more. We can see now the harbour arms, for example, the harbour in a bit more detail. The lighthouses shown as stars on the ends of the harbour arms, that sort of thing. And start to see the terrain in terms of the cliffs being shown through this brown dashed symbol, if you like, sort of marked with vertical dashes. The sheet itself looks a bit like that on the right-hand side. And then you can get a bit of an idea of what is going on here, that this was produced in 1968. And it says also underneath here that it was compiled from maps at the scale of 1 to 100,000 that are from 1964. Now, interestingly, Ordnance Survey don't produce maps at 1 to 100,000, so that we can only assume that this was the Soviet map at 1 to 100,000 that was then used to create that. You can also see underneath, rather interestingly, that it's got the editor's name here. So Makarov was the editor of this map, head of that unit, or the unit commander in charge of producing that map. And that's a phase that you see, or a type of information that you see, sort of appears as a bit of a phase that disappeared once we started to see a greater reliance on satellite imagery, really from the early 1970s onwards. So here's the 1 to 100,000 sheet. Again, you can see the contours in more detail here from 1964. You will also notice that on the bottom corner of the sheet, not only, of course, does it say 1964, but it says that it was compiled from materials, map materials, with a scale of 1 to 63,360. Now, those of you that may know something about Ordnance Survey maps, the older types, the pre-metric, will know that that is the 1 inch to the mile map that Ordnance Survey produced until the Land Ranger series of 1 to 50,000. So we know that, of course, some of this information would have come from Ordnance Survey mapping. And that is also a very interesting point, because then we can say, well, if the maps of Britain were used to derive Soviet mapping, Soviet military mapping, is there something of a flavour and character of that landscape and how it's been depicted and generalized and portrayed that actually permeates through the Soviet cartography? That's something perhaps to consider. A revision of the 100,000 sheet was produced in 1982, so here it is a bit clearer. You can see the settlements have grown quite a lot since then, and funny enough, in the bottom corner it says, well, this was compiled from the 1 to 50,000 sheet of 1981, which is likely to be the Land Ranger sheet, the Ordnance Survey Land Ranger sheet. Of course, it could have also been compiled a little bit from the Soviet mapping at that scale. But the important thing to note here too is that not only do we see the morphology of the town, but also the submarine contours we're starting to see off the coast. So moving forward, again, those 1 to 100,000 sheets that were very useful for terrain assessment, for planning detailed operations, should that ever have come to it, a ground offensive perhaps over the channel. Well, if we look at the 1 to 50,000 sheet, again, this is from 1981, so likely to have been a source for the 1 to 100,000. Well, you can see again here that 1 to 50,000 has been used as a source for this map from 1974, and that is very likely to be the Land Ranger sheet produced by Ordnance Survey. If you look at the town of Dover, we'll start to see that not only they're grey sort of urban generalized blocks, but actually some from very specific buildings that are highlighted in black, such as the Duke of York's Royal Military School, which you probably will know about as a boarding school these days. Now then, that will tell you a little bit about the fact that the Soviet Union was engaged in this huge global mapping project, and that actually topographic mapping was very, very important. This multi-scale idea of creating detailed maps of the landscape, largely so that that could support ground operations. It was very different from the NATO mapping, which generally was much smaller scale, 1 to 250,000 and 1 to 50,000, that were really designed for jet pilots, because ultimately the NATO method of warfare was predominantly through aerial warfare, so they weren't very interested in the detail of the ground. It's also hugely expensive and time consuming to produce maps of that detail, so you needed thousands of cartographers to do that, and the Soviet Union had plenty of those, so that wasn't so much of an issue. But what I want to just introduce to you right now is the second real project that the Soviet Union was engaged in, and that was the detailed mapping of towns and cities around the world. And this really all started from the from the Second World War, and from this sheet, which is the map of Berlin that was planned and executed, drawn in Leningrad, at the map factory in Leningrad, which I'll show you a photo of in a minute. So you might remember Operation Barbarossa, 1941, when Germany invaded the Soviet Union and really got to the gates of Moscow, siege of Leningrad, you might remember that as well. Well, during that time, the Soviet Union was planning, of course, its counter-offensive, and so a lot of books and other materials, trade directories of Berlin were found and gathered, and those then went into the intelligence, if you like, to produce this particular map of Berlin that aided the invasion of Berlin by the Soviet forces. Remember, Germany surrendered on the 8th of May 1945. But that model for Berlin was actually copied and used around the world, so for other cities that the Soviet Union were interested in mapping. And just to show you, this is the very factory. I went to see this just the outside, because it was a pretty much derelict building on the inside, sadly, but this was a couple of years ago in St. Petersburg. Obviously that was Leningrad, and this was the very building that that map of Berlin was made in. And if you have a look on the top of this slide, you'll see this red plaque, which is really like a blue plaque that we have in this country, that indicates that this is Military Cartographic Factory 444, and therefore it is the birthplace of that victory map, as it's called. And not only that, but the mapping of the rest of the towns and cities that were deemed to be important around the globe. So one of my PhD students that's recently completed, Martin Davies, produced this map that shows a distribution really of the towns and cities that are known to have been mapped by the Soviet Union in detail. So you'll notice there's a huge concentration in Europe, particularly Western Europe and Britain, and east coast of China, Japan, east coast of the USA as well, but not so much to the far-flung places of the earth, but nonetheless important towns and cities like Sydney, Rio de Janeiro, Cape Town, for example, Washington, DC, and so on. So just to give you a bit of a flavour of what this looked like, Beijing, a map of Beijing, or a plan, 1 to 25,000 from 1987. The Soviet Union would have produced this. And on the right-hand side, the map of Washington, DC from 1975. Of course, you'll see the Potomac River with the undersea or river contours, if you like, the bathymetric isobars. But you'll also see this very strange iconic building here in green, and that is, of course, the Pentagon, which has been mapped in detail and classified as a military object. It's shown in green, which means that it's a military object. This classification was used on all of the town plans from at least the late 60s, early 70s onwards. And so if we look at this next example, which is the Soviet plan of Dover from 1974, 1 to 10,000 scale, you'll see at the very top, the left-hand side, compiled in 1972. The little print code there tells you that it was printed in Saratov, which was a big map factory, and the unit commander was a certain A.D. Udin, who also then produced other city plans, for example, of London and I believe Birmingham as well. But you'll see just below that, what I've done is just enlarge the legend here for you to see that's from the city plans. There's a huge amount of symbols that were used for these plans, but generally speaking, just a subset were chosen to be put on the plans, and those divided up the important buildings, the strategically important buildings, into three classes. If they were administrative buildings or institutions, if they were anything really to do with government, for example, they were in purple. If there were military buildings, they were put in green, and if there were military industrial buildings, they were coloured black. Each of those was numbered and explained in the key. You might see from the map on the right-hand side that you've got lots of text there. Well, that's a numbered list at the top, and then a street index below that, and then below that is something called a spravka, which is effectively an essay about the military geography of the town or city being shown. Now, I'll show you some details of the sheet to have a look at that and then understand it a little bit more. But from the sense of, if you like, the balance and the composition, you'll see that this is very much focused on Dover. You'll see that it includes the contours as well as the major rail network, railways and road networks that you can see quite clearly. The sheet itself is about 1 metre square, so it's absolutely massive. Now then, obviously you'll be glad I'm not going to read all this out, but the Spravka, rather interestingly, makes some very detailed observations. And again, it's rather interesting thinking about maps as telling a story, as a narrative. Well, actually here on the map, you have this sort of textual narrative that's written out in terms of what is important in Dover. So it talks about the rivers, how wide they are, talks about the sea, that it never freezes, about the widths of the roads, that sort of thing. Talks about the coal mines, and I'll talk about that in a minute in a bit more detail about the coal, that they could be used, some of the coal mines, for underground shelter along with the railway tunnels. The nature of the organisation of the town, mentions the military school, which is of course Duke of York's. Talks about the industries, shipbuilding, paper, that sort of thing. Talks about the port in a lot more detail, and it mentions that there is a coal unloader as part of the port, and that is actually shown on the map, and I'll explain that in a minute. Then it talks, of course, about hospitals and the gas supplies and energy. So it's a lot of information that you would perhaps need to know if you were planning maybe to either invade or to run the town after a successful coup, for example. So if we have a look in a bit more detail at an extract of the plan of Dover, well, you may or may not recognize where some of these places are, but if you have a look in the right-hand side, just like towards the top, the big building here with a ring around the center that's labeled number 9, well, that is the castle. Interestingly, this is called the fort, which is the headquarters of the Coast Guard, rather interestingly. So there are some interesting comments about the maps and how they've been sort of described some of these objects in various ways. Number 10 that you see here on the left-hand side, that's the post office, as classified as a military and communications object. The station, Dover Priory, just on the edge of number 20. And then we have the town hall, the only administrative building on this plan, which is the purple, number 14 here. And then rather interestingly, the object you see here is black, which is number 29. That is the, says this is a power station, but actually at the time, there was very little there to identify it as a power station. So that might give us a bit of a clue as some of the source materials for this. But instantly, you'll notice when you look at the plan that everything, of course, is labeled in Cyrillic, and it's labeled so that, in general, you could pronounce these names so that you would talk more or less and pronounce them in the same way, perhaps, as a local might. So the ideal is to make them so that they're spelled phonetically, so that that would help. So, and that's a little bit less interesting for Dover, but it comes quite useful if you're looking at places like Gloucester, which probably would have caused a bit of a nightmare otherwise. So it gives us a bit of an idea of what Dover looks like. Potentially then, there are other ways in which Dover has been mapped, and this is a likely source, and it has been used as a source for all sorts of other mapping as well. You might wonder what this is. Well, this is the Dover plan from 1 to 10,000 of 1941 that the Germans produced, but if you have a look at a bit more detail, you'll see that actually this is an ordnance survey plan that would have been produced at the 6-inch scale. That's been enlarged to a metric scale of 1 to 10,000, and then anything which is strategically important and the major road, rail networks, that sort of thing, that's been highlighted and classified. And you'll see that if you look very, very carefully, you'll see the bridges highlighted, but you'll also notice that there's this power station here as number 45 next to the town hall, which is labeled 18, and it's very likely that the Russians captured this map, which is part of the Planheft dossier that the Germans compiled for the invasion of Britain, and used it as a source, and that's quite possibly where that idea of the electric, the power station comes from. Waterworks is highlighted up here. Obviously, certain things are not shown in much detail on the ordnance survey map, but they were then added and annotated later. So the whole plan of Dover, the German plan, looks a little bit like this, but you'll notice that there's no contours in the sea, and you'll notice that some of the more sensitive areas like Western Heights, for example, and the Dover Castle has not been included from the Ordnance Survey plan. This has been drawn on by the Germans, largely perhaps from aerial reconnaissance. And some of that, again, enters onto the Soviet sheet. So I was talking about the coal earlier, just very briefly, and thinking about what this meant. Well, what you see in a Soviet mapping of towns and cities, and really the landscape, is this real focus on utility of the landscape, on resources. And rather interestingly, if you have a look at the German plan on the left-hand side here, you'll see that you've got this dashed line going up the eastern breakwater of the harbour, and you'll see a similar line that is coming up the again the breakwater on the Soviet map. Now the interesting thing is that if you have a look at that brown line with the thicker dashes on it, that actually indicates the aerial ropeway that brought the coal from the Tilmanstone colliery, and effectively this would have been discontinued by the time that Soviet map was made in 1974, but it's still shown on the map. And rather interestingly also, if you have a look at that little block in the middle of the that comes out, extends out from the harbour arm, those are the submarine pens, or as they're called, submarine pens, which had actually not much to do with submarines, but were built in 1941 to house the motor torpedo boats. Now the interesting thing is that in the Spravka, actually the Soviet map talks about this being a submarine base, Dover, and the pens might sort of allude to that as well, but these pens were never used as a home for hosting submarines, and submarines, even though they were used in World War One, it's unlikely that Dover basically housed submarines since then. So really, some of this is quite anachronistic. the pens were demolished in 1990. So there's this rich industrial heritage that that the Soviet maps capture. Similarly, if we have a look on the right-hand side, you'll see the coal Staith, this huge coal unloader that was erected on the harbour arm. I think about 1931 this picture was taken, and this was in operation from 1929 to 1952, well before the Soviet map was produced, and yet it's still shown on the map as an anachronism. And funnily enough, again in the Spravka, it actually mentions the rate at which coal could be unloaded at 500 tons an hour, which is really quite staggering that that sort of level of detail has been captured. But there is this real focus towards, again, the industry. So just to provide some interpretation then of all this and thinking about zooming out about what it all means, well, rather interestingly, we can look at the Soviet maps certainly as a way of recording the history and the culture. So we can look at them as a resource in that way. We can also look at them as a way in which socialist realism, if you like, and with it, its association with utilitarianism and positivism, scientific positivism certainly, and functionalism, really kind of embodied a sense of the Soviet ideal through its choice of colours and selection of features. But then also, I think it's important to bear in mind that really what was going on here too was this construction, a cartographic construction, if you like, of the Soviet vision of utopia through these highly secret maps. The town plans were effectively abandoned in a depot outside Riga in Latvia and then discovered by a local orienteer. But these were highly secret, these plans, and effectively he made a deal with the Soviet guards to say, basically, I'll get rid of all of these maps. And they said, well, you have to ask the right question. So he said, well, okay, I'll take away this waste paper for you then. And they agreed to that, and several train carriages of maps then were moved from the army depot to the map publishers in the centre of Riga, rather interestingly. So these are highly secret maps, but they were testifying really to this Soviet construction of this vision of utopia, rather interestingly. So through that vision then, perhaps we can see the landscape through maybe Soviet eyes, what could have been perhaps then, and really the curiosity that they provide today in terms of how those landscapes are shown in such a massively different way, perhaps compared to what we're used to through looking at ordnance survey mapping. Different things are important, of course, different things are shown as well as how they're shown, the blend of colours that's used, as well as the Cyrillic labelling that perhaps some people find quite chilling. So perhaps maybe a final couple of points then, that the afterlife of Soviet maps, we could say, transforms the maps. They've undergone this afterlife. There's a huge amount of interest in them, and ironically, that interest really comes from the countries that have systems, if you like, political systems that the Soviet Union was very much trying to subvert at the time the maps were being made. So rather curiously, there is this transformation of those maps, particularly ironic when maps available to Soviet citizens were distorted and much generalized, so very poor quality. And perhaps also maps transform us too, the way that the Soviet maps help us to look at the landscape, particularly in a new way, what is maybe useful in the landscape. And our industrial heritage that's often missed off a lot of ordnance survey mapping as well. So how the maps produced by the Soviet Union can help us to see our own landscape in familiar and new ways. So maybe a thought to conclude with really is just that perhaps every map is becoming something else, that when these maps were produced in secrecy, those cartographers would not have any idea that one day they would find a completely different use and a completely different appreciation by citizens, if you like, within a completely different democratic system and political system. So that transformation is ongoing, and perhaps it just tells us a little bit about the story of maps, how they continually rewrite and are rewritten when we engage them, and that they have agency in what they are trying to achieve as well. So, okay, I hope that made a bit of sense, and if you want to have a look at some of these maps, including Dover, they're free to have a look at. There's also Chatham on there as well. If you have a look at redatlasbook.com, you can find some, well, about 100 of the city plans of the British Isles that are included in there to have a look at if you want to see if there's anything that you can discover. Great. Okay, I'll hand over to you, Caroline. Thanks very much indeed.